Death at the Ladies' Watercolour Society, a Miss Marple Mystery. Section 1. The Yellow Ochre Afternoon. St. Mary Mead lay under a mild June light, the kind that flatters even the crooked gate at the vicarage and turns the dust on the lane into something almost pale gold. The Ladies' Watercolour Society was to meet that Thursday, as it had met every Thursday since the war, in the long room above Mrs. Bantry's disused stable, which the society had, with a great deal of feeling and very little practicality, decided to call the studio. Miss Jane Marple, in a lavender cardigan she had knitted the winter before, walked up the lane at a pace suited neither to hurry nor to loitering, carrying a small tin of biscuits and a paint-box that had belonged to her mother. The disturbance came, as such things do in villages, before anyone had quite finished their tea. Mrs. Prudence Halloway, the Society's president for 11 consecutive years, a woman who wore her authority the way she wore her pearls, evenly and without apology, was found at the head of the long table, with her cheek resting against a half-finished study of yellow irises, quite still and quite dead. Miss Emily Farrow, the secretary, said afterwards that she had thought, for one merciful instant, that Prudence had merely dozed off, but the tumbler at her elbow was empty, and the pale water in her painting jar had gone a strange, faintly opalescent colour, as though something had been stirred into it that oughtn't to have been. Miss Marple, who had come in only a moment before, set down her tin of biscuits with the particular care one uses at the beginning of grief. She did not, at first, look at Mrs. Halloway. She looked, instead, at the paintings pinned along the picket rail. 7 watercolours in various stages of ambition, and one, Prudence's own, arrested mid-stroke, with a single droplet of yellow ochre suspended at the very edge of the paper, not yet fallen. That drop, she thought, was the shape of the afternoon. Something poised, something about to descend. "Somebody," said Mrs. Bantry, in the voice she reserved for occasions when one must be firm with the universe, "had better telephone Dr. Haydock." "And Inspector Slack," added Miss Farrow, who had been raised to believe in the correct order of authorities. Her hand was shaking a little. She put it behind her back. Miss Marple noticed this and said nothing. There were 7 other members of the society in the room, and Miss Marple, without appearing to do so, arranged them in her mind as one might arrange labelled seed packets on a shelf. There was Mrs. Bantry, hostess and treasurer, robust and forthright, standing near the window with one hand on the sash, as though she meant to open it and had forgotten. There was Miss Emily Farrow, the secretary, thin and dark-eyed, whose fingers were still trembling behind her back. There was young Mrs. Cecily Vane, 26 and lately married to a solicitor in Much Benham, in a pale blue linen dress and with a wet paintbrush still clenched between her fingers, the tip of which was staining her palm a pretty forget-me-not colour without her noticing. There was Colonel Bantry's cousin, Miss Iris Prendergast, 60 and unmarried, and inclined to smile at inappropriate moments, though she was not smiling now. There was Mrs. Delia Marchmont, the doctor's widow, whose paintings were always of ruins, and who was, at that instant, staring at Prudence with an expression Miss Marple could not quite read, pity, perhaps, or something a little older than pity. There was the Reverend Mr. Clement's wife, Griselda, who had come as an occasional guest, and who now stood pressed against the door, as though the door itself might steady her. And there was Mr. Rupert Halloway, the deceased's nephew, the only man in the room, a young painter in a paint-daubed corduroy jacket, who had been permitted to attend on the strict understanding that he did not offer opinions about pigment. "Rupert," said Mrs. Bantry gently, "would you sit down, dear?" Rupert did not sit down. He stood beside his aunt with his hands loose at his sides, and Miss Marple, who had a lifetime of watching young men receive bad news, noted that his face had not so much fallen as tightened, as though a set of small screws behind the eyes had all been turned a quarter inch at once. Grief, in Miss Marple's long experience, arrived in as many varieties as roses. This was not the commonest kind. Dr. Haydock came within 20 minutes. He was a large man with a soft voice, and he did what large men with soft voices do. He lowered the temperature of the room simply by entering it. He bent over Mrs. Halloway, laid 2 fingers very gently on the side of her throat, and then, without looking up, said, "I shall want the tumbler kept exactly where it is, and the water jar. Nobody is to touch either. Mrs. Bantry, might one open the window?" Mrs. Bantry opened the window. The scent of cut grass came in, and with it a single white butterfly, which settled on the rim of the poison jar and then, quite sensibly, flew out again. Inspector Slack arrived rather later, and, being Inspector Slack, arrived at a run. He was a small, quick, aggrieved-looking man, whose method of investigation resembled a terrier's method of investigating a rabbit hole. Much noise, some effect, and a great deal of earth thrown behind him. He herded the ladies into the far end of the studio and began his questions in the order he considered logical, which was not the order in which any of them had thought about the matter. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had drifted, there was no other word for it, to the picket rail. She looked once more at Prudence Halloway's unfinished study of yellow irises. The droplet of yellow ochre had, in the interval, fallen. It had made a small round stain on the wooden floor, no larger than a sixpence. Miss Marple regarded it for what a stranger might have thought a long time. Then she said, quite softly, to no one in particular, "How very like her, to leave a mark." "I beg your pardon, Miss Marple," said Inspector Slack, who had sharp ears. "Nothing, Inspector. I was thinking of the irises." She smiled at him with the mild, half-apologetic smile of an elderly gentlewoman who has never in her life caused anyone any trouble. One does become sentimental about flowers. Inspector Slack, who did not become sentimental about anything, moved on. He wished to know, he said, who had been where and who had touched what, and whether Mrs. Halloway had eaten or drunk anything unusual in the preceding half-hour. Miss Emily Farrow, still with her hands behind her back, said in a small voice that Mrs. Halloway had drunk from the tumbler, yes, barley water, as she always did, poured from the jug on the sideboard, as she always did, and that she, Emily, had poured it herself, as she always did. Her voice cracked on the last, and Mrs. Marchmont, without looking at her, put a steadying hand on her elbow. Miss Marple observed the placement of that hand. She observed, too, that Rupert Halloway had turned very slightly at the mention of the barley water, and that his eyes had gone not to Miss Farrow, nor to the sideboard, nor to his aunt, but to the paintings on the picket rail. Specifically, to the third from the left, Mrs. Marchmont's newest study, a crumbling abbey in ochre and pale grey, in which a single tiny figure walked away from the ruin with her back turned. Yellow ochre, thought Miss Marple, without moving. That was interesting. That was the same colour as the droplet on the floor. Outside, in the lane, someone was calling a dog. The village had not yet learned. In a moment it would, in an hour it would be a story. By tomorrow morning it would be a legend, and by tomorrow evening it would be something worse, which was the truth partially seen. Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to distrust the middle stages of any village's understanding, folded her hands over her paint-box and prepared, very quietly, to wait. Section 2. A kettle in every kitchen. The lane outside the studio, which a quarter of an hour before had held only a butcher's boy and a spaniel, now held 4 women with baskets, and a 5th who had forgotten hers. News in St. Mary Mead did not so much travel as ferment. By the time Miss Marple came down the wooden stair with her paint-box held before her like a small shield, the phrase, "Prudence Halloway, poisoned," in her own barley water, had already been said aloud in 3 separate kitchens, and altered slightly in each. "Now, Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, who had descended with her, "you will come home with me and have a proper cup of tea, and not stand out here being pecked at like a hen in a farmyard." "In a moment, Dolly dear," said Miss Marple. "In a moment. I should like to look at the lane." She did look at the lane, though not, an observer would have said, at anything in particular. She looked at the hedge, and at the gate, and at the strip of trampled grass where the delivery van habitually stopped, and at the small clean patch on the gravel that was very slightly a different colour from the rest, as if something had been recently spilled there and washed away. She said nothing about any of it. She let Mrs. Bantry take her arm. At the vicarage, Griselda Clement had already put the kettle on. She was a young woman, quick-witted and untidy, and she had the great virtue, in a crisis, of not asking questions until people had drunk something. She poured out 3 cups, sat down opposite Miss Marple, and only then said, "I keep thinking about her face. It wasn't afraid, Aunt Jane. That's what I can't stop thinking. It wasn't afraid at all." "No," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "It wouldn't have been." "Why do you say that?" "Because," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea, "Prudence Halloway had known for some time that she was disliked. When one has known a thing for that long, one ceases to fear it. One only waits to see which hand will do the disliking, and how." Mrs. Bantry snorted. Disliked. She was detested. Do you remember the fate, 2 summers ago, when she took the ribbon away from little Sally Webb and gave it to her own niece? Half the mothers in the parish would have gladly stood her against a wall. Yes, said Miss Marple, but not, I think, in the middle of the society, in the middle of a Thursday afternoon, in front of 7 witnesses. That is a very particular kind of dislike. That is the dislike of somebody who wishes the act to be seen. Or the dislike, said Griselda, of somebody who wishes the act to be blamed on someone else. Miss Marple looked at her with mild approval, as one looks at a promising pupil. Yes, dear, that too. The talk in the village that afternoon, sifted through the sieve of Mrs. Bantry's cook and the vicar's daily woman and the postmistress at the little glass grill, distilled itself, by 4:30, into 3 principal theories, all of them wrong. The first theory, favoured chiefly by the older women, was that Mrs. Marchmont had done it. Mrs. Marchmont, the doctor's widow, painted ruins and read morbid poetry, and had once, everyone remembered, refused to speak to Mrs. Halloway for 3 months over a matter concerning the graveyard bench. Mrs. Marchmont's fingers, moreover, were always faintly stained with pigment, and pigment, said the older women darkly, was not so very far from poison. The second theory, favoured by the younger women, was that Miss Emily Farrow had done it. Emily was thin and dark-eyed and unmarried at 38 and had been Mrs. Halloway's secretary for 11 years, during which Mrs. Halloway had corrected her spelling in front of the society upwards of 400 times. It was said, in the younger kitchens, that anyone would eventually snap, and that Emily had, that morning, been seen buying something at the chemist's in Much Benham. The third theory, favoured chiefly by the men, who did not attend the society, but who felt entitled, as men do, to an opinion, was that young Rupert Halloway had done it for the money. Rupert had come down from London a fortnight before, in a shabby jacket, and with an unpaid tailor's bill in his pocket, and his Aunt Prudence had been, in the vulgar phrase, the only person standing between him and destitution, or, more precisely, between him and inheritance. The men agreed, over their pints, that a nephew in corduroy was worth watching. Miss Marple listened to all 3 theories, in different sitting rooms and over different biscuits, and said very little. She said once, "How interesting," and once, "Poor thing," and once, of Rupert, "He has his mother's eyes, I always thought." She did not correct anybody. She did not, either, agree. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and let the village pour its opinions over her, as one lets rain fall on a well-tended garden, knowing that not all of it will be useful, but that some of it, distilled, will keep the roses alive. Only once, in Mrs. Price Ridley's parlour, did she offer a remark of her own. Mrs. Price Ridley had been holding forth on the wickedness of the modern young, and had said, with a certain relish, that of course it would turn out to be Rupert, because young men who painted in corduroy were, in her experience, capable of anything. "Do you know, dear," said Miss Marple, "I was thinking of quite a different young man, the boy who used to deliver the fish, years ago, do you remember? He murdered his mother-in-law with a hat-pin, and everybody said afterwards how surprised they were, and I remember thinking at the time that they oughtn't to have been, because he had always been so very polite. In my experience, it is not the corduroy one watches, it is the politeness." Mrs. Price Ridley did not quite know what to do with this, and offered another biscuit. By 5:30, Miss Marple was walking home along the lane, more slowly than usual, with the low sun making a warm line along the tops of the hedges. She stopped, once, to look again at the little clean patch on the gravel outside the studio, and this time she bent, very carefully, one hand on the gate, and touched the tip of her forefinger to the stone. It came away with the faintest smear of colour on it, not quite yellow, not quite ochre, something between. She held her finger up to the light, considered it, and then, with the small, clean handkerchief she always carried, wiped it away. "How very tidy of somebody," she said, almost cheerfully, to the hedge. The hedge, which had heard a good many secrets in its time, said nothing. At the studio door, Constable Polk was standing with his arms folded and his helmet slightly askew, having been posted there by Inspector Slack with instructions to admit nobody. He touched his helmet to Miss Marple as she passed, and Miss Marple, who had known him since he was a small boy in a smock, smiled at him kindly and did not ask any questions at all, which unsettled Constable Polk considerably more than questions would have done. She went home. She fed the cat. She sat down at her little writing desk in the window, opened a fresh page of her notebook, the plain, black-covered one she reserved for parallels, and wrote, in her careful, upright hand, 3 words. Yellow. Ochre. Barley. Then, after a moment's thought, she added a 4th, politeness. The evening bells rang across the fields. Somewhere in the village, someone was already grieving. Somewhere else, someone was arranging a face for the morning. Miss Marple closed the notebook, laid it under her paint-box, and, with the untroubled expression of a woman who has decided to be patient, went to make her supper. Section 3. Inspector Slack makes a list. The morning after Mrs. Halloway's death broke clear and windless over St. Mary Mead, with that particular quality of English June light which makes even freshly laundered curtains seem faintly indecent in their cheerfulness. Miss Marple, up at 6 as she had been all her life, watered her geraniums, considered the sky, and went, at the unhurried hour of 10, to call at the vicarage. She did not go, of course, to call at the vicarage. She went, as everybody in the village presently understood, to be within 20 yards of the studio at the precise moment Inspector Slack would be conducting his second round of interviews. That the vicarage happened to lie between her cottage and the studio was, Miss Marple would have said with perfect placidity, one of those small conveniences by which Providence rewards the punctual. Griselda, who had learned to read her, only smiled and said, "He's in there now, Aunt Jane. He's been in there since 8. He shouted at Constable Polk twice already." "Poor Polk," said Miss Marple. "He's got Miss Farrow in with him at present." "Ah," said Miss Marple. She took her tea by the vicarage window, which gave a very good view of the studio door, and while she took it, she asked Griselda a number of questions of no importance whatsoever, about the Sunday school, about the state of the vicar's boots, about whether the roses along the south wall were doing better this year than last. Griselda, answering, understood perfectly that Miss Marple was not listening and did not mind. At length, Miss Emily Farrow came out of the studio. She came out slowly, with her hat not quite straight and her handbag held against her chest, as though she thought it might, at any moment, try to escape her. She did not look toward the vicarage. She turned in the other direction and walked, with a strange, stiff quickness, toward the lane that led to her own little cottage behind the post office. Miss Marple set down her cup. "Griselda, dear, would you mind terribly if I—" "Not at all," said Griselda, who was already moving to open the door. Miss Marple did not overtake Miss Farrow at once. She followed her at the leisurely pace of a woman on her way to the post office, until Miss Farrow, at her own gate, fumbled with the latch for the 3rd time and dropped her handbag on the path. Then Miss Marple was, quite suddenly, at her elbow. "Oh, my dear, do let me. There. And no, don't hurry. Sit for a moment on the seat. You are white as a sheet." Miss Farrow sat. Miss Marple sat beside her, in the little arbour where Miss Farrow's late mother had trained a white rambler up an old iron frame. For a moment neither of them spoke. The rambler, which had bloomed early that year, dropped a single petal into Miss Farrow's lap. She stared at it as though she had never seen a rose. "He thinks it was me," she said finally. Her voice was thin and quite level. "He thinks I put something in the jug." "Inspector Slack," said Miss Marple gently, "thinks a great many things in the course of a morning, dear. It is his method. He puts them all out on the table, like a boy sorting marbles, and by the afternoon he will have decided which ones he means to keep. He asked me why I went to the chemist's in Much Benham on Tuesday. And what did you say?" Miss Farrow looked at her hands. "I told him the truth. I went to buy a tonic. For my nerves. I have not been sleeping." "Ah," said Miss Marple. She waited. In her long experience of listening, she had found that a small silence, kindly offered, drew more than any question. "He didn't believe me," said Miss Farrow, and her voice cracked at last, quite quietly, like a china cup that has stood too long on a hot stove. "He didn't believe me because there was another bottle, on Prudence's shelf. He said arsenic. He said it very softly, the way one might say a rude word in front of a child." Miss Marple did not for a moment reply. She looked at the rambler, then she said, "Emily dear, may I ask you a question that will sound impertinent, and please believe I do not mean it so?" "Yes." "When Mrs. Halloway corrected your spelling, I remember, it was quite recently, in front of the whole society, did you feel, at that moment, that you could kill her?" Miss Farrow, who had opened her mouth to protest at the impertinence, closed it again. A curious thing happened to her face. It did not flush. It went, if anything, a shade paler, but her mouth moved into something that was almost a smile, a tired, honest, ashamed smile. "Yes," she said, for about 4 seconds. And then I felt ashamed of myself, and I went and made her a fresh cup of tea, and I thought no more about it. "Thank you, dear," said Miss Marple, and patted her hand. She left Miss Farrow sitting under the rambler and walked, still unhurriedly, back toward the studio. On the way she thought, not about arsenic, and not about barley water, but about the small, clean patch on the gravel, and about the smear of ochre on her fingertip the evening before. Inspector Slack, she suspected, had not looked at the gravel. Inspector Slack was inside, with his marbles. He was, indeed. She found him standing over the long studio table, with Prudence's unfinished irises before him, and a notebook open in his hand. Constable Polk, at the door, hesitated over whether to admit her, and Miss Marple, with the air of a woman who has decided the matter for him, walked in. "Miss Marple," said Slack. He did not quite sigh. "I do not wish to intrude, Inspector. I wondered only whether I might collect my paint box. I left it here yesterday." "It is on the sideboard." "Thank you." She did not at once go to the sideboard. She looked instead at the picket rail. 7 paintings had been pinned there yesterday, in the moment of the tragedy. This morning there were 6. Mrs. Marchmont's ruined abbey, the one in ochre and pale grey, was gone. "Inspector," she said mildly, "has one of the paintings been taken as evidence?" Inspector Slack looked up sharply. "Which one?" "Mrs. Marchmont's." He crossed to the rail. He counted. He counted a second time. His face darkened. "Polk!" Constable Polk came in. "You were on the door all last night." "Yes, sir." "Did anyone enter this room?" "No, sir. Only yourself this morning, and Dr. Haydock at 11 last evening, to collect samples, sir." "And no one else? No member of the society?" "No, sir." Slack turned back to the picket rail, as though he might discover the painting by staring at the empty pin. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had drifted, again there was no other word, toward the sideboard. Her paint box lay upon it, exactly where she had left it. Beside it, on the polished wood, was a very small mark, no larger than a farthing, the same faint ochre yellow as the smear she had wiped from her finger the evening before. She looked at it a moment. Then she picked up her paint box and put it under her arm. "Thank you, Inspector." "Miss Marple," he hesitated. Slack did not, as a rule, ask civilians their opinions, but he had, in the course of an earlier case, learned that Miss Marple's opinions, though offered obliquely, sometimes saved him a great deal of paperwork. "What do you make of Miss Farrow?" "Oh, Inspector," said Miss Marple with a small, sad smile. "I make of Miss Farrow exactly what one makes of any secretary who has been humiliated in public for 11 years. I make of her a woman who is unlikely to have done anything at all. People who have been quietly humiliated for 11 years do not, in my experience, act. They endure. It is those who have been humiliated only once, and privately, and unexpectedly, of whom one must be careful." Inspector Slack, who had not the least idea what to do with this observation, closed his notebook. Miss Marple at the door paused. "Inspector, the gravel outside, just where the delivery van stops." "What of it?" "There is a clean patch. Someone has washed something away. It might be worth photographing before the sun dries it out entirely." She went out. Behind her she heard Inspector Slack saying, in a tone she recognized as the beginning of belief, "Polk, the gravel, now." She did not smile. She never smiled at such moments. She only, as she walked down the lane, adjusted the strap of her paint box and thought, quite gently, of the missing abbey, and of the single figure walking away from the ruin with her back turned. Section 4. The nephew in corduroy. By noon, Inspector Slack had, in the manner of terriers everywhere, chosen his rabbit hole. Rupert Halloway had been observed at 1:30 on the previous afternoon, walking down the lane from the direction of the studio, some 20 minutes before his aunt had been discovered dead. He had been observed, moreover, carrying nothing when he came, and carrying something small under his jacket when he went. Constable Paulk, who had a memory like a well-kept ledger, was quite certain on this point, and Inspector Slack, who had been looking for a certainty since 8 in the morning, seized upon it with a small, audible sigh of relief. Miss Marple heard of it from Mrs. Bantry, who had heard of it from her cook, who had heard of it from Constable Paulk's aunt, who cleaned at the vicarage on Wednesdays and had told Griselda on Thursday morning, which was the very morning in question. The chain of report, Miss Marple thought, was almost as interesting as the report itself. It had come, that is, from the constable to the aunt, to the vicarage, to the cook, to Mrs. Bantry, to herself, and by the time it arrived, the small something under Rupert's jacket had grown, in some tellings, into a bottle, and in others, into a knife. Miss Marple mentally divided the object by 4 and thought, something the size of a paintbrush. At 2, Rupert was taken by Inspector Slack into the small back room of the police station at Much Benham to answer a few questions. At 4, he was still there. At 5:30, he was released. He walked home along the fields because he did not, he told Griselda afterwards, wish to be stared at along the lane. Griselda took him into the vicarage kitchen and gave him bread and cheese and a great deal of very strong tea, and it was there that Miss Marple, arriving with a jar of gooseberry preserve she had been meaning to bring for a fortnight, discovered him. He rose to greet her with the automatic courtesy of a young man well brought up. His eyes, close up, were red at the edges and quite dry. He had, Miss Marple noticed, a small blue-green smudge on the underside of his left wrist, of the kind a painter acquires from leaning across his palette. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope you have not come to arrest me. Everyone else in the village has, more or less." "I have come," said Miss Marple, "to leave a jar of preserve, and to sit down for a little if I may. My knees are not what they were." Griselda drew out a chair. Miss Marple sat. She accepted a cup of tea, waved away the sugar, and, for some minutes, spoke of nothing more consequential than the height of the delphiniums. Rupert, at first stiffly, then more easily, spoke back. Griselda, wise beyond her years, said very little and watched. "Your aunt," said Miss Marple at length, in the tone of a woman remembering a small kindness long past, "always used to admire the delphiniums at the vicarage. I remember she once said to me, at the summer fete, it must have been 3 years ago, that they were quite the best in the county, and rather wasted on a clergyman. She said it, I think, quite seriously." Rupert laughed once, dryly. "That would be Aunt Prudence." "Yes." "She had a talent," said Rupert, looking into his tea, "for saying the thing that would sting, but saying it in a way that meant one could not decently answer back. It was almost an art. One of the arts, that is, in which she was truly accomplished." "And her watercolours?" said Miss Marple mildly. Rupert's mouth did something small and complicated. "Her watercolours," he said, "were very bad, but she considered them very good, and everybody in the society had, for 11 years, agreed with her. I think," he looked up, "I think that is what I most disliked about them, not the paintings, the agreeing." Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing the way people spoke of the dead, filed this remark carefully. It was not the speech of a man who had murdered his aunt, nor was it the speech of a man who had loved her. It was the speech of somebody who had lived, for a long time, at a small and precise distance from a person he could not either respect or ignore. It was, in her experience, quite the commonest kind of family speech there was. "Tell me, Rupert," she said, "what were you carrying under your jacket when you came down the lane on Thursday afternoon?" The kitchen went very still. Griselda set down the teapot without a sound. Rupert looked, for the first time, directly at Miss Marple. His eyes, close to, were a light hazel and quite tired. "A sketchbook," he said. "A small one, 6 inches by 4. I had been drawing in the churchyard. I did not want anyone at the society to see what I had been drawing, because it was of Aunt Prudence. From memory, not kindly." He paused. "I did not kill my aunt, Miss Marple. I had many reasons for wishing her not present in my life, and no reason at all for wishing her dead. She was, in point of fact, on the very point of writing me a cheque. For how much? £200, to settle my tailor. She had promised it that morning. He gave a small, tight laugh. One does not, in general, murder the goose 10 minutes before it lays the egg. No, said Miss Marple gently, one does not. She sat for a moment, turning the teacup in its saucer. Then she said, "May I see the sketchbook?" Rupert hesitated. Then, from an inner pocket, he drew it out. It was, indeed, 6 inches by 4, bound in green cloth and slightly bent from having been carried for a day and a night against his ribs. He turned to the last page and laid it, open, on the table. The drawing was in soft pencil. It showed Mrs. Prudence Halloway from the shoulders up, in 3/4 profile, seated at the head of a long table with a tumbler at her elbow. Her mouth was set in the small, complacent line Miss Marple remembered so well. Behind her, faintly, were pinned watercolours on a rail, and beside the tumbler, drawn with the exactness of a young man who had studied anatomy, was a single droplet, poised at the edge of a painting not yet fallen. Miss Marple looked at the drawing for a long moment. "When did you draw this, Rupert?" "Yesterday morning, in the churchyard, before I went to the studio." "Before?" "Before." She said nothing. Griselda, watching her, saw that her hand, resting on the edge of the sketchbook, had gone quite still, the small stillness of a woman rearranging her mental furniture. "Rupert," said Miss Marple at length, "who else knew that you had drawn this?" "No one." He frowned. "I showed it to no one. I told no one I meant to draw it. Why?" "Because," said Miss Marple, "someone in that room yesterday afternoon poisoned your aunt in the presence of a poised droplet, and you, sitting a mile away in the churchyard the same morning, drew a poised droplet without knowing it. It is either the largest coincidence I have met in 50 years, or—" She did not finish the sentence. "Or the person who poisoned her had also seen this drawing, which, since you showed it to no one, means that the person who poisoned her had been in your rooms." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the vicarage garden, a thrush was singing with the innocent indifference of a creature that did not understand human housekeeping. "I lodge at Mrs. Marchmont's," said Rupert slowly, "since I came down from London. I had, a small room at the top of her cottage. My sketchbooks are on the shelf beside the bed." Miss Marple closed the sketchbook and pushed it, very gently, back across the table. "Rupert," she said, "I do not think you killed your aunt. I think somebody wished, very much, that you should be thought to have. And that is quite a different matter, and, I am afraid, a rather more dangerous one." Outside, the thrush went on singing. Miss Marple finished her tea. She rose, and she said, with the mildness that in her, always, meant that a small, hard resolution had been formed, "I think I shall pay a call on Mrs. Marchmont tomorrow. About ruins. I have always meant to ask her about ruins." Section 5. Ruins and Ochre. Mrs. Delia Marchmont's cottage stood at the far end of the lane, where the hedge thickened and the road began, half-heartedly, to consider becoming a path. It was a low, whitewashed place, with a slate roof that had been mended too many times, and a garden which, in June, always looked as though someone had begun a great work in April, and then, in the middle of it, remembered a more interesting one. Miss Marple, arriving on the Saturday morning with a small posy of white pinks from her own border, thought that the garden had, this year, been let go a little further than usual. Mrs. Marchmont answered the door herself. She was a tall, pale woman of 50, with grey eyes set deep in a long face, and hands stained faintly at the knuckles, with pigment that no amount of washing ever quite removed. She wore a grey linen smock over a dark skirt, and her hair, which had once been chestnut, was drawn back plainly. "Miss Marple," she said, "come in. I was expecting you." "Were you, dear? I have known you for 30 years. Of course I was expecting you." The parlour into which she led Miss Marple was low and cool, and smelled of turpentine, old books, and the sweet mustiness of dried lavender. Above the fireplace hung one of Mrs. Marchmont's own paintings, a large watercolour of Netherfield Abbey in evening light, the stones very pale, the sky above them the colour of a bruise. In the foreground, quite small, was a single figure walking away from the ruin. It was not the same figure as in the missing painting from the studio, but it was the same subject. Mrs. Marchmont, evidently, had painted this figure many times. "Tell me, Delia," said Miss Marple, seating herself in the low chair by the window. "Who is she?" "The figure?" "Yes." Mrs. Marchmont poured out coffee. Her hand, Miss Marple observed, was perfectly steady. "She is nobody in particular. She is the person one ceases to be when one leaves a ruin behind one. I paint her, I suppose, because I like the idea that one can walk away." "And can one?" Mrs. Marchmont set down the coffee pot. She did not answer at once. "Sometimes," she said finally, "not always." Miss Marple accepted her cup. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside in the garden, a bee was fumbling in the delphiniums. It was very peaceful. "Delia," said Miss Marple, "your painting from Thursday, the one that was pinned on the rail beside Prudence's irises, it is not there now." "No." "Do you know where it is?" Mrs. Marchmont looked at her steadily. "It is upstairs, in my bedroom, under the bed if you would care to see." "When did you fetch it?" "On Thursday night, about 11. Constable Polk had gone round to the back to relieve himself. I came in through the side door, took the painting off the pin, and went home." She said this as calmly as she might have said that she had taken a book down from a library shelf. "You may tell the inspector if you wish." "I do not think I shall," said Miss Marple mildly. "Not yet." "Delia, why did you take it?" Mrs. Marchmont set down her own cup. Her long fingers curled a little in her lap. "Because," she said, "I did not wish it looked at, and because I did not wish it thought about. It has nothing to do with Prudence's death, but people, Jane, are not clever. People will look at a painting, and they will see what they wish to see, and then they will make a story of it, and I should be in the middle of that story, and I have been in the middle of a story before." "Have you, dear?" The bee in the delphiniums moved to the next spike. Mrs. Marchmont's grey eyes went for one instant to the painting above the fireplace and back again. "Yes," she said, "many years ago, before I came to St. Mary Mead. It was it does not signify where. I was engaged to be married. He was a solicitor. He had a difficulty with money that was not his. I found out. I told him I would not marry him unless he made it good. He made it good. He then, 3 months later, drowned himself in a canal, and everyone in the town said that I had driven him to it. I had not driven him to it, Jane. I had told him only that he must be honest. But that was the story that was made, and I could not unmake it, and I left. I came here. I painted ruins. I have not, in 22 years, been in a story again." Miss Marple looked at her with great gentleness. And Prudence knew. Prudence knew. She was at school with a cousin of his. She wrote to me in April and asked whether I remembered him. "By letter?" "By letter." "Is the letter here?" "Yes." She rose. She went to a small walnut writing desk in the corner, unlocked the top drawer with a key from her pocket, and drew out a folded sheet of pale blue notepaper. She brought it, without hesitation, to Miss Marple and laid it in her lap. The handwriting was Prudence Halloway's. Miss Marple would have known it anywhere. Firm, upright, faintly satisfied with itself. The letter said, in essence, that Prudence had lately been reminded, by a chance meeting with an old school friend, of a young solicitor of a certain name who had died some 20 years before, under circumstances everyone in his town had considered a great pity. She hoped, Prudence wrote, that dear Delia was quite well. That was all. It was, Miss Marple thought, one of the neatest little acts of small cruelty she had ever seen committed to paper. There was no threat in it. There was nothing to which one could reply. There was only the naming, the raising of a stone in a place where a stone had been, for 2 decades, moss-grown and out of sight. "When she gave you this," said Miss Marple, "what did you do?" "I burned the envelope. I kept the letter. I painted more ruins." "You did not reply?" "I did not reply. I attended the society. I sat beside her on Thursdays. I passed her the water jar. What else was I to do, Jane? Move again? Leave a second village? I am 50. I have not the strength." Miss Marple folded the letter very carefully, along the crease Prudence had put in it, and handed it back. "Delia, my dear, I should like to ask you a question that will sound impertinent." "Yes?" "On Thursday afternoon, at any point between 2 and 3, did you go near the sideboard where the barley water stood?" "No." "You are quite certain?" "I am quite certain. I was at the window, painting light on old stones. I did not move for 40 minutes. Rupert can tell you. Emily can tell you. Cecily Vane can tell you. I did not go near the sideboard." Her voice was quite steady. "Jane, if I had wished to kill Prudence, and I will not pretend to you that I did not, in a certain small way, wish it, I should not have done it in front of 7 witnesses in a room where I was the person she had most recently threatened. I am not a fool." "No," said Miss Marple, "you are not a fool." She rose. She held Mrs. Marchmont's hand for a moment, and then, at the door, she said, "Delia, what colour of paint was on Prudence's brush when she stopped?" "Yellow ochre." "And on yours?" Mrs. Marchmont looked at her a moment. "The same," she said quietly. "The same tin. We had been sharing it." Miss Marple went out into the sun. In her pocket, the small notebook lay against her hand. She did not take it out. She walked, slowly, along the lane, and she thought about a tin of yellow ochre shared between 2 women, and about a droplet suspended at the edge of a page, and about the little clean patch on the gravel outside the studio from which somebody had washed something away. The motif, she thought, was sharpening. Not one droplet, but many. Not one ruin, but many. Not one figure walking away, but several, and one, at least, walking back. Section 6. The Whitening of the Roses. Miss Marple did not, at once, go home. She turned aside at the church and walked up through the little wooden gate into the churchyard, where the yews had been clipped by the sexton some 10 days before, and stood black-green and severe against the summer sky. It was in the churchyard, on the low bench under the yew nearest the porch, that she had, as she had known she would, the second conversation of that morning. Cecily Vane was sitting on the bench. She was in the same pale blue linen she had worn on Thursday, or a fresh copy of it. Her hair was tied back with a ribbon of the same colour, and her hands, which on Thursday had been stained a pretty forget-me-not blue, were now folded neatly in her lap, and were quite clean. She was looking at a headstone. When Miss Marple sat down beside her, she did not, for a moment, seem to notice. "Cecily, dear." "Oh, Miss Marple, good morning. May I sit?" "Please." They sat. The headstone at which Cecily was looking was, Miss Marple observed, an old one. Anne Weatherby, wife of Thomas Weatherby, 1873, and had no possible connection with anybody now living in the village. It was the headstone, Miss Marple thought, of a woman required to be looking at a headstone. "I was thinking," said Cecily after a while, "about Mrs. Halloway." "Yes, dear. I was thinking that I did not like her, and that I am ashamed to have not liked her now." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "that is a very natural feeling, my dear, and also, if you will forgive me, a slightly incorrect one. One is not required to have liked people in order to be sorry that they are dead. The two are quite separate matters, and it is a mistake, I have seen it many times, to bind them together, because it tempts one into a false grief, and false grief always, in the end, becomes false innocence." Cecily turned her head very slowly. Her eyes were young and clear, and, Miss Marple observed, a little too fixed. "Miss Marple," she said, "you are speaking to me in a particular sort of way." "Am I, dear? I am so sorry." "You are speaking to me as if you thought I had done it." "No, dear, I am speaking to you as if I thought you knew something you have not told anybody, which is quite a different thing, and which, in my experience, is quite the commonest thing in any village. Most of us know a little more than we have told. It is one of the ways we manage to remain on speaking terms." Cecily said nothing. She was very still. On her wrist, Miss Marple noticed, there was a small mark, half a fingernail's length, of a colour that might once have been forget-me-not blue and had been imperfectly washed away. "Dear," said Miss Marple very gently. "Why did you cry on Thursday evening when you went home?" Cecily's face went for one instant quite young, the face, that is, of the schoolgirl she had been 6 years before. "How do you—" "Your maid, dear. Mrs. Bantry's cook is her aunt. Villages, Cecily. One cannot escape villages. Why did you cry?" Cecily looked at her hands. Then, in a voice so low that Miss Marple had to lean in a little, she said, "Because I had told her, on Wednesday afternoon, that I hated her." "Told whom?" "Told Prudence." "Ah." "I met her on the lane. She had been very unkind to me about my painting at the last society, in front of everybody. She had said that I painted as though I were arranging flowers for a shop window, and that one could not, on the whole, take shop window painters seriously. Cecily's mouth trembled once and steadied. "I have not been married very long, Miss Marple. Frank does not read my letters, and does not, I think, listen very carefully when I speak. The society was the one place where somebody looked at what I did, and she said that in front of everybody. And on Wednesday, on the lane, you told her that you hated her." "I told her that I hated her. I told her," I said it very quietly, because I did not wish anybody to hear. "I said, 'I hope, Mrs. Halloway, that one day somebody speaks to you exactly as you have spoken to me, and that on that day I am there to see it.' And she looked at me, and she smiled, and she said, 'My dear child, that will require a level of imagination I do not think you possess.' And she walked on." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then she said, "And on Thursday afternoon, at the society, where were you standing when she drank from the tumbler?" "By the sideboard. I had come to refill my paint water." Cecily met her eyes. "I did not put anything in the jug, Miss Marple. I did not touch the jug, but I saw somebody who did." Miss Marple's hand on the arm of the bench did not move. "Whom, dear?" "I saw Miss Farrow." There was a pause. In the great yew above them, a wood pigeon spoke twice and then thought better of it. "Miss Farrow," said Miss Marple slowly, "poured the barley water. That is her regular duty. You saw her pour it?" I saw her pause. Before she poured, she took a small paper twist out of her pocket, and she looked at it, and then she put it back, and poured the water, and carried the tumbler to Prudence. That is what I saw." "You are quite sure she put the paper back into her pocket?" "I am quite sure." Miss Marple considered this. Then she said, "Cecily, have you told this to Inspector Slack?" "No." "Why?" Cecily hesitated. Then she said very simply, "Because I said on Wednesday that I hated her, and because I stood by the sideboard on Thursday, and because I thought if I told the inspector about Miss Farrow, he would say, 'And how convenient, Mrs. Vane, that you should have seen this from where you were standing.' Miss Marple, I am 26. My husband already believes I paint like a shop window arranger. I did not wish to be believed a murderess as well." Miss Marple rose. She put her hand for a moment on Cecily's shoulder. "Dear," she said, "you must tell the inspector. Not today. Today he is with Rupert and will not listen. Tomorrow. And you must tell him also that you told me first, and that you told me because you were frightened. He will not, I think, mistake you." Cecily nodded once. Miss Marple walked home slowly. She did not, this time, look at the gravel outside the studio, because she had already looked. She looked, instead, at the roses on either side of the lane. It had been a dry spring, and the white ramblers had come out later than usual, and were only now in full flower. She noticed, with the corner of her attention, that the roses along Miss Farrow's south wall had been, at some point since Thursday, trimmed rather closely, as though something at their roots had been dug up and reburied. That evening, she opened her small black-covered notebook, and beneath yellow, ochre, barley, politeness, she wrote in her upright hand a new line: "Paper twist, roots of white roses, a woman whose grief is exactly the right shade." She looked at the words for some time. Then she closed the notebook and set it once again beneath her paint box. She thought of Miss Farrow sitting under her white rambler in the arbour, saying quietly, "I felt ashamed of myself, and I went and made her a fresh cup of tea, and I thought no more about it." She thought of the tremor of that hand behind that thin back. She thought of Cecily Vane on the churchyard bench, saying, I saw her pause. She took a small paper twist out of her pocket. She thought, too, of Mrs. Marchmont saying calmly, "We were sharing the tin." Somewhere in that arrangement, Miss Marple knew, one person was telling the exact truth, one person was telling most of the truth, and one person was telling, with great skill, a lie so shaped that it fit precisely into the truth, the way a false stone fits into a wall of true ones, and cannot be seen until one runs one's hand along the wall in the dark. She would, she thought, have to run her hand along the wall in the dark. She poured herself a small glass of elderflower cordial, sat down by the window, and let the June evening settle. Section 7. The Second Tumbler. The blow that reshaped the case fell on Sunday morning, between the first and second hymn, when Constable Polk, flushed, hatless, and clutching his notebook against his chest like a man carrying an infant across a stream, appeared at the church door and beckoned, with a series of small, urgent motions, to the vicar. The vicar excused himself. The organ, in the middle of "The King of Love my shepherd is," slowed uncertainly and then, after a moment's consultation with itself, resumed. Miss Marple, in her pew, folded her gloved hands more closely in her lap. Griselda beside her whispered, "Something has happened." Something had happened. Miss Emily Farrow had been found, at 8:30 that morning, at the foot of the stairs in her own cottage, with her neck broken and a small brown medicine bottle overturned on the third step above her. On the kitchen table there lay a sheet of pale notepaper, on which, in Miss Farrow's neat clerkly hand, were written 6 lines. "I have not been able to sleep. I have been very foolish. I did not mean it to go so far. I have loved this village, and I have served it well, and I hope it will remember me for that, and not for the other thing. Forgive me. E.F." Inspector Slack, at the scene by 10, considered the case, in his own phrase, wrapped up. He wrapped it a little too fast and a little too loudly for Dr. Haydock's taste. Dr. Haydock, examining the body, said mildly that a broken neck was not, in his experience, an inevitable result of a fall of 6 stairs, and that he would prefer to be certain before he signed anything. Inspector Slack heard him out with the impatience of a terrier at a rabbit hole in which he can already see a tail, and returned to Much Benham with the note in his pocket. Miss Marple heard the news, in its several forms, in the church porch, in the lane, and, most fully, in Mrs. Bantry's morning room over sherry, which Mrs. Bantry had decided the occasion demanded. She said very little. She drank her sherry in small, exact sips. She agreed, when spoken to, that it was terrible, that poor Emily had never been quite herself, that villagers did not know their own sorrows. Then she rose and said she must be going, and walked to the vicarage, where Griselda, having anticipated her, had the kettle on and the back parlour empty. "Aunt Jane," said Griselda, "do you believe it?" "That she wrote the note?" "Yes, I believe she wrote the note. That is her hand. I have been receiving society minutes from her for 11 years. That is her hand. But I do not believe she wrote it this week, and I do not believe she wrote it in this house. And I do not, above all, believe that she, of all people, jumped down 6 steps. She sat down. She accepted her cup. She said, half to herself, "There is a peculiarity in the note, Griselda dear." "What is it?" "I did not mean it to go so far. It is a phrase, is it not, that one uses of something one has begun, something one is doing, not of something one is being done to. Emily was not the beginner of things. She was, all her life, the person to whom things happened. It is the wrong grammar for her. Somebody has copied her hand, or, more probably, has kept an old letter of hers, in which she once used those words about some quite different matter, and has produced it now." Griselda, whose training as a clergyman's wife had made her, unexpectedly, one of the most level-headed people in the village, said, "Who would have kept such a letter?" "Somebody," said Miss Marple, "who keeps letters." She did not at once name Mrs. Marchmont. She did not need to. Griselda's eyes were on her. "Prudence Halloway," said Miss Marple slowly, "kept letters. That is a matter of common knowledge. She sat for 20 years on a great many committees, and she wrote a great many notes to a great many people, and she kept in a locked box in her writing desk replies she considered useful. She used to boast of it in her way. She once said to me at a fete that people would be very much more careful of what they set down on paper if they remembered how long paper lasted. So the person who killed Prudence would also, if intelligent, have known about the box, and would have gone sometime between Friday and Saturday to the Halloway house, which, you will recall, is not being guarded because Inspector Slack believed the case was already narrowing to Rupert, and would have opened the box and would have taken from it exactly one letter, one in which Emily Farrow, on some quite different occasion, had written those words, and would then, last night, have gone to Emily Farrow's cottage, and would have, Griselda, I do not wish to say the rest aloud, but you understand. Griselda understood. Miss Marple set down her cup. I should like, she said, to look at the third step of Emily's staircase. They went that afternoon together. Constable Pork was on the door, and being still, as one might say, Miss Marple's Constable Pork, since she had once taught him his catechism, he admitted her when she said, with perfect placidity, that Mrs. Clement wished to fetch the Society Minutes book, which had been in poor Miss Farrow's keeping. This was true. The Minutes book was fetched. It was also, in the fetching, necessary to pass the foot of the stairs. Miss Marple stopped at the foot of the stairs. She looked at the third step. It had, upon its front edge, a small chip, no larger than a farthing, from which a fresh, pale wound of unweathered wood showed. She looked then at the wall beside the step, at the level of a standing woman's head. There, at just that height, a faint smear had been imperfectly wiped away. She looked last at the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. It was of oak, and had been polished many years. On one side of its top, at the level of a woman's temple, was a bruise in the wood. A bruise, that is, in the polish, not in the wood itself, as though something had struck it, and then been wiped, and then struck again, and been wiped again. Griselda, said Miss Marple quietly, Emily Farrow did not fall down these stairs. No. She was struck against the newel post twice, I think, and laid at the foot afterwards, and the bottle set on the third step so that we should think. She stopped. Yes. They went out. Constable Polk locked the door behind them. Miss Marple, on the little path, paused and said, half to the constable and half to the summer sky, Constable, when Inspector Slack next passes, would you say to him from me, with my compliments, that he might find it useful to fingerprint the newel post before somebody thinks to polish it again? Yes, Miss Marple. She walked home. The village that afternoon was very quiet. 2 deaths in 4 days had produced in St. Mary Mead that particular hush in which every hedge seems to be listening. Miss Marple, in her cottage, sat down at her writing desk, opened her notebook, and beneath her earlier lines wrote, Emily Farrow did not begin things. Somebody wanted her to have begun this. Then, after a long pause, she added, The murderer is a person who copies handwriting, who copies grief, who copies, perhaps, other things. She thought then of a small blue-green smudge on a young man's wrist, of the exactly right shade of Mrs. Marchmont's stillness, of a paper twist withdrawn and returned to a pocket. She thought of the missing painting under Mrs. Marchmont's bed, and of the letter with a burnt envelope, and of a shared tin of yellow ochre. She thought, above all, of Cecily Vane on the churchyard bench saying, I saw Miss Farrow pause. She took a small paper twist out of her pocket. She looked at it and put it back and poured the water. Cecily had put a very particular sentence into her head. Cecily was young. Cecily was, in her small way, quite frightened. But Cecily was also, Miss Marple faced the thought without flinching, the only person in the room apart from Miss Farrow who had been at the sideboard when the tumbler was poured. The motif, she thought, had turned again. It was no longer merely a droplet. It was a small paper twist in the pocket of a woman who had never in her life begun anything. Section 8. A cup of tea for Mrs. Vane. Miss Marple's tests were not, on the whole, tests that anybody being tested would have recognised as such. She had learned, in a long life of watching, that people would guard themselves against a question, but would rarely guard themselves against an offered cup of tea. On Monday morning, therefore, at 11, she called at the little house Cecily Vane had lately taken with her husband at the far end of the village, with a small covered basket in which lay a jar of gooseberry preserve, a paper of tea cakes from Mrs. Sweeterman's, and, carefully wrapped in a clean cotton handkerchief, a very small paper twist. Cecily opened the door herself. Her husband was away, at Much Benham, on legal business. The Daily Woman was upstairs. The house had that quiet, slightly aired quality of a house lately married into. Cecily was in a fresh linen dress and pearl earrings that Miss Marple, whose eye for such things was gentle but exact, noted had been given to her, probably, by her mother-in-law. She smiled, a little uncertainly, at the doorstep. "Miss Marple, do come in." They took tea in the small front parlour, which looked out on a garden Cecily had not yet mastered. The delphiniums, Miss Marple observed, were struggling. Everything else was doing very well. "I have brought you," said Miss Marple, as they sat, "a jar of preserve. And May, my dear, this may seem an odd thing, but I wondered whether I might ask a favour of you." "Of course." "You paint, dear, and you paint very prettily indeed. I know Prudence was not always kind about your painting, but I have always liked it, and I would like it particularly if you would do a small watercolour for me, of anything you like. It is for my goddaughter's birthday, and my hand shakes too much these days for the sort of thing I used to attempt." Cecily flushed with pleasure, the true, undisguised pleasure of a young woman not often praised. Of course I will. What size?" "Small, perhaps 6 inches by 4, about the size of a sketchbook page." Miss Marple did not look at her when she said this. She looked into her teacup. "There is one small thing, dear. I have brought," she opened her basket, "the paper for it. Would you use this? It is a particular sort of paper my sister used to send me from London, and I have been keeping the last of it for a nice occasion. I should like to see it used before it yellows." She produced from the basket a sheet of pale watercolour paper, folded once. Beneath the sheet, still in its clean handkerchief, was the small paper twist. She did not, at first, produce the twist. She waited. She talked for a moment of other things, of the sermon on Sunday which the vicar had thought rather too long, and of the roses, and then, as one reaches into a bag for a forgotten glove, she reached back into the basket, drew out the handkerchief, unfolded it, and set the small paper twist quietly on the tea table between them. "Do you know, dear," she said, in the same mild tone, "I found this in the churchyard on Saturday morning, on the little path near the yew. I could not think what it was. I have been meaning to ask you. You were sitting on the bench that morning, were you not? Whether you had noticed anybody drop it." The paper twist was small. It was creased in the exact fashion in which a chemist twists a paper for a customer at his counter. It was empty. Miss Marple had, at home the night before, taken an old envelope and folded it in that manner, and had then rubbed it lightly at one corner with the very faintest trace of yellow ochre. Cecily Vane looked at the paper twist. She looked at it, Miss Marple thought, for perhaps 3 seconds longer than a wholly innocent person would have looked at a piece of litter mentioned in conversation. Then she looked up, with a face that was quite composed, and said, "How curious. No, I didn't see anybody drop it." Miss Marple, still mildly, said, "I only ask because you told me you saw Miss Farrow, in the studio on Thursday afternoon, take a paper twist of that kind out of her pocket. I thought perhaps you had. Perhaps you had recognised this one, and it might be a comfort to you to know that whatever had been in it was long gone." Cecily's teacup rattled very slightly in its saucer, only slightly. The tremor lasted perhaps a quarter of a second. She set the cup down. "No," she said, and now her voice had gone a shade, the smallest shade, more even than before, in the way in which a voice goes even when its owner has just decided to be careful. "No, I don't recognise it. Miss Farrow's had, I think it had, a different, I could not really see, Miss Marple. I was a little way off." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "Of course, dear, of course you were." She wrapped the paper twist gently in its handkerchief again and put it back in the basket. She smiled. Now, the paper. You will do the picture. I am so pleased. Perhaps a small study of the churchyard. The yew has been very fine this year. Yes, said Cecily. The churchyard. Yes. They spoke for another quarter of an hour of other things. Cecily was, at first, a shade too animated, and then, quite suddenly, tired. She pleaded a headache. Miss Marple, most understandingly, took her leave. At her own gate, Miss Marple stopped. She stood for a moment with her basket over her arm and her hand on the latch, and she looked, without appearing to do so, at the little house at the far end of the village. Cecily Vane, at the window of her front parlour, was standing quite still. She was not looking out at the lane. She was looking down at her own hands, which she had folded, tightly, one over the other, at her waist. It was, Miss Marple thought, a very small reaction. A tremor of the cup, an evenness of voice, a stillness at a window. In a court of law, it would have amounted to nothing. In a village kitchen, it would have amounted to less. But Miss Marple was neither in a court nor a kitchen. She was, as she had always been, at the exact distance from her subject at which the smallest fracture in a person's composure can be seen, as one sees in a certain slant of afternoon light the hairline crack in a piece of otherwise perfect china. She went indoors. She fed the cat. She sat down at her writing desk and, beneath her earlier lines, added a fresh one. Cecily did not drop her cup. She only rattled it. It is not the young woman who lies out of malice. It is the young woman who has been asked to lie by somebody older and who has agreed to it because she is afraid. She sat then for a long time quite still and thought. There was a shape now in her mind. It was still faint. It was the shape one sees in the dusk, when a hedge and a figure become one thing for a moment before separating again. She saw a person, she saw, not yet a face but a person, who had disliked Prudence Halliway with a very old and very quiet dislike, who had known about the letterbox, who had known about the paper twist, who had known Rupert's sketchbook, who had had, moreover, an arrangement with the exact one witness who could most usefully be persuaded to look in a particular direction. A young, unhappy, wounded woman, easily flattered, easily frightened, and, this above all, easily persuaded that she had seen a thing that had not, in fact, happened. A person, in short, who did not commit their crimes alone, so much as arrange them the way one arranges flowers, or a society, or a village. Miss Marple picked up her pen. She turned to a fresh page, and she wrote, in her small, careful hand, one single sentence. Not a name, but the sentence in which a name is caught, as a fish is caught in a pool by a stillness at the water's edge. The person who has agreed to Cecily's lie is the person who fears Cecily's truth. She closed the notebook. She rose. She said, aloud, to the cat, "Well, that will do for tonight." The cat, who had heard, in the course of a long life with Miss Marple, a good many odder remarks, purred once and settled its paws. Section 9. The Shape in the Hedge. Tuesday morning came in with a thin, low mist along the fields that thinned by breakfast and by 10 had left the roses shining. Miss Marple, who had slept little, rose earlier than her habit. She dressed with the small precision she reserved for occasions on which she meant to do a great deal of listening. She drew on her second-best hat, the grey straw with the lavender ribbon, because it was the hat in which she had, at various times over 40 years, been most comprehensively trusted, and she went out. She went to the post office. She spoke for a few minutes to Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, who was Miss Farrow's second cousin on her mother's side. Miss Weatherby was a small, dry woman who had, Miss Marple felt, more feeling than her manner suggested. They sat, briefly, in the little parlour behind the counter, and Miss Marple, in a voice barely above the click of the wall clock, asked one question. "My dear, when Emily and Delia Marchmont were girls together, for they were they not? Before Delia came to St. Mary Mead, was there anybody they had both known?" Miss Weatherby looked at her a long moment. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, Miss Marple, there was. Emily was Delia's cousin, on the mother's side. Nobody in the village knows it, because Delia wished it not to be known. She came here 22 years ago and asked Emily to say nothing, and Emily said nothing. That was Emily. But they were cousins, and they had grown up in the same house, in the same town, in the trouble, you know, with the young solicitor. Emily was there for all of it." "Ah," said Miss Marple, very softly. "Emily loved Delia, Miss Marple, in her quiet way. I think Emily would have done a great deal for Delia." Miss Marple thanked her. She left. She walked, past the vicarage, past the studio, past the churchyard, and up to Mrs. Marchmont's cottage. She stood at the gate a full minute, looking at the whitewashed cottage and the neglected garden and the delphiniums which, here, as in Cecily Vane's, were not thriving. Then she opened the gate, went up the path, and knocked. Mrs. Marchmont opened it. She had, Miss Marple observed, been at her easel. Her fingers were stained fresh, and there was a smudge of paint on her cheekbone, pale grey this time, not ochre. "Delia," said Miss Marple, "may I come in?" "Of course." They sat in the low parlour. The painting over the fireplace had been slightly straightened, as though somebody had dusted the frame that morning. "Delia," said Miss Marple, and she folded her hands in her lap and did not, this time, drink her coffee. "I have been to the post office. I have spoken to Adelaide Weatherby. She has told me that Emily Farrow was your cousin, and that she knew you when the young solicitor died, and that she has kept your secret in this village for 22 years. Mrs. Marchmont said nothing. Her long face had gone very still, in the way of a face that has been prepared for a particular question for a long time, and has, at last, met it. "You loved her," said Miss Marple gently. "Yes." "She was your cousin. She was, I think, more than your cousin. She was the only person in this village who had known you as a girl, and who had known you the trouble before you came here. She was the only person who could, at any moment, have told the story, and who, in 22 years, never did." "Yes." "And when Prudence Halloway wrote you her letter in April, when Prudence made it plain that she knew, you understood, did you not, that Prudence would sooner or later find her way to Emily too, because Prudence would not have been content, in the end, to keep the pleasure of the knowledge to herself. It was not, in Prudence, a pleasure that could be kept to herself." Mrs. Marchmont did not, for a long moment, speak. Then she said, in a voice from which all the pigment had been washed, "Yes." Miss Marple did not at once ask the next question. She sat and let the room hold what had been said. Then she said, quite mildly, "But you did not kill her, Delia. You have told me you did not go near the sideboard, and I believe you. Rupert has told me the same, and Cecily has told me the same, and I believe them. Somebody else put the arsenic into the barley water, somebody who had access to Prudence's letterbox, and to Rupert's sketchbook, and to the sideboard, and to Emily's back staircase, and to Cecily Vane's imagination. And that person, Delia, is a person who, I am very sorry, my dear, is a person who told you nothing beforehand, and who, in doing what she did, believed, with the whole of her strange, kind heart, that she was defending you." Mrs. Marchmont's grey eyes closed once, very slowly. When they opened, they were bright. "Emily," she said. "Emily," said Miss Marple. "But Emily is dead." "Yes, my dear, Emily is dead. And I am afraid, I am very much afraid, that whoever killed Prudence has also killed Emily. Precisely because Emily did what she did, and precisely in order that Emily should now be believed to have done what she did not do." She paused. "That is the peculiar cruelty of the thing, Delia. There have been 2 murderers in this village, but only one arrest is possible. Emily poisoned Prudence out of love for you. Somebody else, having found it out, first arranged for Rupert to appear guilty, then, when the evidence turned, killed Emily to fasten the guilt on her, for a dead woman cannot answer back. And that somebody is the person we must, quietly, name." Mrs. Marchmont was weeping now, quite silently, without moving her hands from her lap. "Delia," said Miss Marple, "who else, in this village, knew that Emily was your cousin?" Mrs. Marchmont did not answer at once. She lifted her head. Her face, tear-marked, had gone into the particular, terrible clarity of a person who is remembering. "Only Adelaide Weatherby, and my sister-in-law, my late husband's sister. She lived with us for the first year I was here. She left when my husband died. She lived afterwards she lived in London. She married a solicitor." "Yes?" "And returned to St. Mary Mead 6 years ago with her husband, when he took his practice at Much Benham." Mrs. Marchmont looked at Miss Marple, and her mouth moved once. "Frank Vane, Jane. Cecily's husband is my sister-in-law's son. Cecily is the daughter-in-law of the only other person in this village who knows I am Delia." Miss Marple sat very still. In the great hedge of her mind, the shape had finally separated from the leaves. It was not and had never been one shape. It was two. "Delia," she said gently, "who is at home this afternoon, at Frank Vane's mother's cottage?" "Only Marian. Marian Vane. Frank is at Much Benham. Cecily is with Marian." "Ah." She rose. She did not, this time, offer her hand. Instead, she said, "Delia, one last thing. When you told me on Saturday that you had taken your painting off the pin on Thursday night, was that true?" "Yes." "You went into the studio after Constable Polk had gone to the back?" "Yes." "And you saw nobody?" Mrs. Marchmont, whose face was already exhausted, thought. There was a light on, briefly, at the Halloways' upstairs window. Prudence's window. Very brief. It could have been the moon on the pane. I thought it was the moon." "It was not the moon, my dear," said Miss Marple. "It was a woman opening a locked box." She went out. She walked, this time more quickly than she had walked in some years, along the lane, past the studio. Constable Polk, in some surprise, saluted her twice, past the churchyard, past the post office, past her own cottage, and up to Mrs. Bantry's, where she asked for the telephone. She spoke to Inspector Slack. She spoke to him for perhaps 4 minutes. She was, at the end of it, quite calm. "Inspector," she said, "it would be, I think, a great kindness if you could come to St. Mary Mead this afternoon, to the small house at the far end of the village. There are, I believe, 2 women there this afternoon, and only one of them ought to leave it in your company. I shall be there at 3. I should be very much obliged if you would arrive at 10 past. She rang off. She sat down on Mrs. Bantry's window seat. She looked for a moment at the summer garden. "Dolly, dear," she said, "I shall want a very small, strong cup of tea, and after that, if you will forgive me, I have a most unpleasant call to pay." Section 10. A painting on the easel. The house at the far end of the village had a low green door and a brass knocker in the shape of a fox. Miss Marple lifted the knocker and let it fall, once, and stood, small, grey-hatted, unhurried, in the June sunlight until the door was opened. It was opened by Cecily. Behind Cecily, at the far end of the little hall, on the threshold of the front parlour, stood a tall, spare woman in a dark green dress, with iron-grey hair drawn very smoothly back, and eyes the same pale hazel as her son's. "Miss Marple," said Cecily. "My dear, good afternoon. Mrs. Vane, I hope I do not disturb you." "You do not disturb me, Miss Marple," said Marian Vane. Her voice was low and even and very courteous. "Cecily, do bring Miss Marple in." They went into the parlour. It was a room arranged, Miss Marple observed at once, with an almost military exactness. Every ornament stood at the precise centre of its shelf. On the easel in the window, the easel was Cecily's, of course, Marian did not paint, stood a small watercolour half-finished, the churchyard with the great yew, and, on the bench beneath the yew, 2 figures. Miss Marple, without appearing to look at it, saw at once that the second figure had been begun, and then, at the moment of the face, been left. "Do sit down," said Marian Vane. "Cecily, tea." Cecily, who had gone a shade paler at the sight of Miss Marple's hat, went out. Miss Marple sat. She did not, at once, speak. She looked at Marian Vane with the mild, entirely unremarkable expression that had, in the course of her life, undone a good many people who had thought themselves proof against elderly ladies in grey straw hats. "Mrs. Vane," she said at last, "it was you, was it not, who came to Prudence Halloway's writing desk on Thursday night, and took from the locked box a single letter of Emily Farrow's?" Marian Vane did not move. There was no tremor at all. Her long hands in her lap were as still as her painted ancestors above the mantel. "I do not," she said, "know what you mean, Miss Marple. You knew about the box because your sister-in-law had told you of it 22 years ago, in her first months at St. Mary Mead, when she had been threatened with a rumour, and had spoken to you of the sort of women who kept such rumours in writing. You returned to St. Mary Mead 6 years ago. You made it your business, quietly, to keep Delia's secret, because Delia was your late brother's wife, and your affection for your brother, though he has been dead these 15 years, has never left you. That is a kind of loyalty which I do not, my dear, mean to belittle. It is only that yours took, in the end, a very particular form. Miss Marple. Prudence Halliway made a great mistake, said Miss Marple, in the same mild tone. She thought that she had, in her letter of April, made Delia afraid. She had made Delia afraid, but she had also, unknown to her, made Emily Farrow afraid, because Emily loved Delia, and Emily saw, as clearly as you saw, that Prudence would not stop with one letter. Emily made her small paper twist at the chemist's in Much Benham on Tuesday. Emily brought it, on Thursday, to the society. Emily poured the barley water. Emily poisoned Prudence. That is the first crime, and I do not think, my dear, you knew of it beforehand. I think you knew of it only when it was done, and when, as you looked into Emily's face at the picket rail, you understood, as a woman can understand a woman, exactly what had happened and why. Marian Vane had not moved. She had not spoken. Only a small line had appeared between her brows, the line, Miss Marple thought, of a person who is listening. You could, at that moment, have told the inspector. You did not. You made, I do not doubt you told yourself it was for Delia's sake, a different decision. You decided that Emily had done, in effect, what Delia might have wished done, and that Emily should not be punished for it. And you decided further that somebody must, however, be punished, in order that the inquiry should end, and Delia's name should not be dragged, over months, through a court in Much Benham. You looked about you. There was Rupert, freshly arrived, in corduroy, disliked and, most useful of all, the natural inheritor of Prudence's estate. You had, some months before, been in Mrs. Marchmont's cottage on a Sunday visit, and had, one supposes idly, climbed the little stair to admire Rupert's paintings, and had seen the sketchbook in which, as it happened, he had drawn his aunt. You had noted, as women of your kind do note, its exact hiding place. On Thursday night, you went to the Halliway house. You had, from your late brother's papers, a duplicate of the little key to the writing desk, for it had belonged, before Prudence, to your husband's mother. You unlocked the box. You took out a letter of Emily Farrow's, a letter, I imagine, written on some quite unrelated occasion, in which the words, "I did not mean it to go so far," happened to appear. And you removed also that letter of Prudence's to Delia, so that it should not one day, in the case's ripening, be found and read. The line between Marian Vane's brows had deepened. It was, Miss Marple thought, the only movement in the room. On Sunday, when the case appeared to be slipping, Emily on the verge of confession, Inspector Slack more attentive than you had hoped, you went to Emily Farrow's cottage in the early morning. You brought the letter in which you had, with careful work at the ink, altered the date to be recent. You told Emily, I imagine, that you had come to protect her, that Delia had confessed everything, and that the two of you must contrive a story. You took her, in her nightgown, to the foot of the stairs, and you struck her, twice, against the newel post of her own house. Cecily, in the doorway with the tea tray, dropped a spoon. Neither woman, in the parlour, turned. Marian Vane's face had gone the colour of very old paper. The tumbler in the studio, said Miss Marple quietly, was Emily's crime. The bottle at the foot of the stairs was yours. And Cecily, she turned to the doorway, is guilty of nothing but a lie you asked her to tell on Saturday, that she had seen Emily take a paper twist from her pocket. You needed a witness who was not Delia. You chose Cecily, because Cecily was your son's wife and could be kept. Cecily, in the hall, had begun to weep quite silently. Miss Marple did not turn. You did not, Marian Vane, kill Prudence Halliway. Emily Farrow killed Prudence Halliway. That distinction will matter in a court, and I have made it clear to Inspector Slack. But you murdered Emily on Sunday morning in her own house, with your own hands, under the pretence of loving her. You did not love Marian Vane. You arranged. You have arranged all your life other people's dignity, and on Sunday morning you arranged Emily out of the world. Miss Marple set down her cup at last. Somewhere behind her, in the lane, a car had drawn up. The engine cut off. A door closed briskly. Marion Vane looked toward the window. Her eyes, when they returned to Miss Marple, were for the first time quite unguarded. The astonishment of a woman who had thought herself several degrees more intelligent than her circumstances, and who had discovered, in her own parlour, that this was not, after all, the case. "You are," she began, and stopped. "An old woman in a straw hat," said Miss Marple, without pride. "Yes." Inspector Slack knocked briskly at the door. Cecily, still weeping, admitted him. He came into the parlour with his notebook in his hand, and Constable Polk behind him. "Mrs. Vane," said Inspector Slack, in a voice from which every trace of terrier had, remarkably, gone. "I must ask you, please, to accompany me to Much Benham." Marion Vane rose. She smoothed her skirt with hands that no longer trembled, because they had never trembled. She looked once, very steadily, at the small, unfinished watercolour on Cecily's easel, the churchyard, and the great yew, and the two figures on the bench of which one had a face and the other did not. And then she said, "Very well." She went out with him. She did not, at the door, look back. Miss Marple rose and went into the little hall, where Cecily was standing against the wall, and put her hand very lightly on Cecily's arm. "My dear," she said, "you will tell the inspector tomorrow exactly what you were asked to say, and exactly why. And then, if I may advise you, and I hope I may, you will begin at last on a painting in which the second figure has a face." Cecily nodded once, silently, and turned her face into Miss Marple's shoulder. Outside in the lane, the car drove away. In the delphiniums, the bee, for it may have been the same bee, resumed its patient, wholly indifferent work. Section 11. The Yellow Ochre Evening. The village, in the days that followed, did what villages do. It absorbed. It rearranged itself around the two graves in its churchyard, as a stream rearranges itself around two new stones, with a small change of sound at first, and, in the end, no change at all. The Ladies' Watercolour Society, after a decent interval, resumed its Thursday meetings. The president's chair at the head of the long table was left, for the first month, respectfully empty, and, at the second month's meeting, was quietly occupied by Mrs. Bantry, who had never sought the position and was therefore, on the whole, the correct woman for it. The tumbler by which Mrs. Halloway had drunk her last barley water was, upon Dr. Haydock's suggestion, quietly removed from the sideboard and replaced by another of a slightly different shape, so that no one, coming into the studio, should have to remember the first. Delia Marchmont did not, at first, return to the society. In September she returned. She painted, that autumn, one ruin, and after that, at last, she began to paint other subjects: an oak tree, a stile, a duck pond. In the pictures of that autumn, Miss Marple observed with private pleasure there were no figures walking away. Rupert Halloway inherited his aunt's estate. He paid his tailor. He also, having discovered in himself, in the course of the case, a small talent for kindness he had not previously suspected, took a modest house in the next parish, kept a room for Delia Marchmont in case of illness, and paid, quietly and by anonymous cheque, for the yearly upkeep of Emily Farrow's grave. He did not, ever, marry. He continued to paint, and in his portraits, for it was portraits in the end, at which he was best, there was, throughout the rest of his working life, a very faint recurring device, no larger than a farthing, at the corner of each canvas, a single yellow drop, poised on the edge of a leaf, of a cup, of a page, of a wrist. Nobody in the London galleries knew, ever, what this device meant. Rupert did not tell them. Cecily Vane did what Miss Marple had suggested. She told the inspector, in a plain, small voice, exactly what she had been asked to say on the churchyard bench that Saturday, and exactly by whom, and exactly why. She was not, in the event, prosecuted, though she was, for some months, spoken of. She attended 2 assizes at Much Benham, sat very upright in a plain grey dress, and gave her evidence about Marion Vane in the same plain, small voice. Her husband, Frank Vane, stood by her, more from an obscure sense of moral obligation than from love. The marriage, however, did not, in the end, survive the winter of that year, and Cecily returned in the spring to her mother's house at Little Ambleford. She continued to paint. Miss Marple, who took an interest, was privately told by Mrs. Bantry, who had been through Little Ambleford in April, that the paintings Cecily now made were, for the first time, not of flowers or of church porches, but of people, quite ordinary people, with faces. Marion Vane was tried at Much Benham Assizes in October. She pleaded not guilty on the advice of her son, and was defended with great skill by an eminent counsel who made much of her age, of her domestic position, and of the fact that no living person had directly witnessed the striking of Emily Farrow against the newel post of her own staircase. The prosecution, however, which had been prepared, in the calmest of small, careful conversations, by Inspector Slack and, indirectly, by Miss Marple, produced in evidence the key from Marion Vane's dressing-table drawer, which fitted exactly the writing desk in Prudence Holloway's morning room. The altered letter of Emily Farrow's, whose original ink, upon careful examination, proved to be some 6 years older than the penciled date at its head. The fingerprint of Marion Vane on the newel post in Emily Farrow's cottage, and Cecily's evidence in the small, plain voice. The jury retired for 40 minutes. Marion Vane was convicted of the murder of Emily Farrow, and at the second trial in November, of no lesser charge in respect of Prudence Holloway than that of being an accessory after the fact. She was sentenced. She did not, at either sentence, look at her son. She died some 6 months later of a stroke in the prison hospital at Holloway. Delia Marchmont, upon hearing the news, did not weep, but painted on that day a picture of a stile in evening light, in which, for the first time in her life, there was no figure at all. She sent it unsigned to Miss Marple. Miss Marple hung it above her writing desk, where it is still, if you happen to know the cottage, hanging. And Miss Marple herself, Miss Marple, who had never in her long life been a person who required, at the end of a matter, a great deal of feeling brought to bear in her own direction, went, on the evening after Marion Vane's arrest, to the little bench in the churchyard, under the yew, and sat for a time with her hands folded in her lap. The evening was still. The bells were rung at the usual hour for practice. Somewhere in the lane, a child called for a dog. The dog, more slowly than in June, came. The vicar, coming out of the porch, saw her and joined her. He was a mild man, and he had lately lost a friend in Prudence Holloway, for he had liked her, in the way that clergymen sometimes like people the rest of the world does not, and he sat beside Miss Marple in silence for a while before he spoke. "Miss Marple," he said at last, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, Mr. Clement. You said, at the vicarage, on the second day, Griselda told me, that in your experience it was not the corduroy one watched, it was the politeness." "Yes." "You suspected Marion Vane, then, from the first?" "No, Mr. Clement, I did not suspect Marion Vane. On the first day I did not know her, particularly. I had met her only in church, and in her son's house, and she had at those times been civil. On the first day I suspected only a shape. I suspected the shape of a person who arranged things. When one has lived in a village for a very long time, Mr. Clement, one comes to know that the most dangerous of the villagers is not the loud one, or the angry one, or the young man in shabby clothes, but the person who is always at the centre of somebody else's decisions. Marion Vane, in the end, revealed herself not by any dishonesty of manner, for her manner, to the last, was perfect, but by the fact that everybody around her had, without noticing, begun to arrange their small dishonesties to fit hers. Cecily lied because Marion asked her to. Emily died because Marion decided she should. Even Delia, poor Delia, was, without knowing it, being arranged. Her silence in April, her silence in May, her silence in June, all of them were, in some part, arrangements Marion had thought of first. That is the shape, Mr. Clement, that one watches. It is quieter than corduroy, and it wears very good pearls. The vicar looked at her a while. Then he said, "You have not, I think, told me who I should suspect next." "No," said Miss Marple, and smiled. "That is Providence's work, Mr. Clement, not mine." The bells stopped. The evening settled. The yew, which had known in its 200 years a good many of the village's stories and had not been surprised by any of them, moved once, faintly, in the small breeze. Miss Marple rose. She put her hand for a moment on the arm of the bench. She looked, before she left the churchyard, at the 2 new stones near the porch, Prudence's, in polished granite, already faintly weathered, and Emily's, in plain grey Cotswold, which the sexton had set flush with the grass at Delia's particular request. On Emily's, beneath the name and the dates, at Delia's further request, a single word had been carved. The word was cousin. Miss Marple looked at it for perhaps a full minute. Then she said, in the small, clear voice she used for the closing of any matter, "There, my dear, there now." She went home. The lane was already in shadow. From Mrs. Bantry's kitchen at the end of it came the smell of ham and new bread. From the vicarage further along came the low, honest murmur of Griselda scolding a kettle. From the fields beyond, invisible, came the last of the June light, which, in St. Mary Mead, was always at that hour a pale ochre, the same pale ochre precisely that Prudence Halloway had been painting when she died, and that Delia Marchmont had once, long before, mixed with tears in the corner of another woman's ruin. Miss Marple opened her own gate. She went in. She fed the cat. The end.